The lights went out at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, and I knew immediately it was going to be one of those days. I was in the middle of a video conference with 3 hospital administrators in Portland when my screen went black, and the sudden silence in my home office felt like someone had wrapped the entire house in cotton. My name is Quincy, and I run an electrical engineering consulting firm from my home in Maplewood Springs, Arizona, a planned community about 40 miles east of Phoenix. The development was built in 2019, one of those cookie-cutter neighborhoods where every house looks almost identical, with beige stucco exteriors, red tile roofs, and landscaping that consisted primarily of rocks and the occasional drought-resistant shrub. The whole place was governed by the Maplewood Springs Homeowners Association, which had more rules than the entire state legislature. I grabbed my phone and checked the utility company's outage map. A transmission line had gone down somewhere between here and the main substation, and the estimated restoration time was blinking ominously at 8 to 12 hours. In Arizona summer heat, even in October, that was going to be a problem for a lot of people. The temperature outside was still hovering around 94 degrees, and without air conditioning, houses in this part of the country turned into ovens fast. I walked through my house to the garage, where my backup generator sat ready. It was a Honda EU 7000 IS, one of the quieter inverter generators on the market, capable of running at about 60 decibels at rated load. I had installed it 18 months ago with a proper transfer switch, hiring a licensed electrician to make sure everything was up to code. Living in Arizona, where summer storms could knock out power for days, having a backup generator just made sense. Plus, my work required reliable electricity. I could not afford to lose power during critical client meetings, or when I was in the middle of designing electrical systems for medical facilities. I went through the startup procedure, checking the oil level, making sure the fuel tank was full, and verifying that all the connections were secure. The generator purred to life, settling into a steady hum that was barely louder than a normal conversation. Within minutes, my house had power again. The air conditioning kicked back on, my computers rebooted, and I was able to send a quick email to the Portland administrators explaining the situation and rescheduling our meeting. I had been running the generator for maybe 45 minutes when I heard the knock on my front door. Through the decorative glass panel, I could see a woman standing on my porch, her arms crossed, her face already twisted into an expression of disapproval. I recognized her immediately. Brenda Morrison, president of the Maplewood Springs HOA board, a woman in her early 50s with shoulder-length blonde hair that was definitely enhanced by expensive salon visits, and a perpetual look that suggested she had just discovered someone had left their trash cans out past collection day. I opened the door, and before I could even say hello, Brenda launched into her prepared speech. "Mr. Quincy, I need you to turn off that generator immediately," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "It is in direct violation of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions." Section 12, Paragraph 7 specifically prohibits the operation of generators except in cases of medical emergency. I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "Brenda, the power is out. The entire neighborhood is without electricity." "That does not constitute an emergency," she said, consulting a printed copy of the HOA rules that she had brought with her. "The rule is very clear. Generators may only be operated if a resident has medical equipment that requires continuous power." "Do you have medical equipment that requires continuous power?" "No, but I work from home. I need electricity for my business." "Then you will need to make alternative arrangements," The generator must be turned off within the next 15 minutes, or the HOA will be forced to assess fines. The first violation is $250. Subsequent violations increase by $100 each day. I felt my jaw tighten. Brenda, this is ridiculous. The generator is properly installed, it is not particularly loud, and I am not bothering anyone. Half the neighborhood probably wishes they had generators right now. The rules exist for a reason, Mr. Quincy. If we allow one person to violate the CCRs, then everyone will think they can do whatever they want. Maplewood Springs is a community built on standards and order. Now, will you turn off the generator voluntarily, or do I need to document this as a formal violation? I took a slow breath, trying to keep my temper in check. I had dealt with Brenda before. Mostly over minor issues like the shade of brown I had painted my front door, which she insisted was not on the approved color palette, even though I had the paint store's confirmation that it matched exactly. She had a reputation throughout the neighborhood as someone who took the HOA rules seriously to the point of absurdity. I will tell you what, Brenda. Let me look at the exact wording of that rule, and if it really does prohibit what I am doing, I will consider my options. But I am not turning off my generator in the middle of a workday during a power outage. Her eyes narrowed. This is not a negotiation. You have 15 minutes. She turned and walked back down my driveway, her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. I watched her get into her white Mercedes SUV and drive away, presumably to go find someone else to harass. I went back inside and pulled up the digital copy of the HOA CCRs that I had saved when I bought the house. It took me a few minutes to find Section 12, Paragraph 7, and when I read it, I felt my blood pressure rise. The rule stated that generators were prohibited except when necessary to power medical equipment required for the health and safety of a resident. There was no mention of emergency situations, no common sense exception for power outages, just a blanket prohibition unless you had a medical necessity. I called my neighbor, David, who lived 3 houses down. He was a retired attorney who had mentioned more than once that he thought the HOA was overreaching its authority. David, it is Connor. Do you have a minute? Sure, what is going on? I heard you have a generator running. Lucky you. My house is already up to 85 degrees inside. I explained the situation with Brenda and the HOA rule. David listened quietly, and when I finished, he let out a long sigh. Yeah, that sounds like Brenda. Look, technically, the CCRs are a legal contract that you agreed to when you bought your house. If they say no generators except for medical purposes, then they can enforce that. However, you might have an argument about reasonableness. Arizona law does require HOAs to exercise their authority in a reasonable manner. Prohibiting a quiet, properly installed generator during a legitimate power outage might be considered unreasonable, especially if it is not causing any actual harm to anyone. So, what do? You could fight it. Send them a letter explaining why you believe the rule is being unreasonably applied. Document everything. If they fine you, you can dispute it, and if it goes to arbitration or court, you might win. But I will tell you right now, it will be a headache. Brenda does not back down easily. I am noticing that, I said. The other option is to just turn off the generator and deal with the inconvenience. Maybe get a battery backup system instead, though I am not sure if they have rules about those too. I thanked David for his advice and hung up. I looked at the clock. Brenda's 15-minute ultimatum was almost up. I walked back out to the garage and looked at the generator, still humming along peacefully, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Then I looked at my office, where I had 3 more client meetings scheduled for the rest of the afternoon. two of which involved contract negotiations that could not easily be rescheduled, I decided to call Brenda's bluff. I left the generator running. 20 minutes later, I received an email from the HOA management company, Silver Valley Property Management. It was a formal notice of violation, complete with photos that Brenda had apparently taken of my generator running. The email stated that I was in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 7, and that I had 24 hours to remedy the violation or face a fine of $250. If the violation continued beyond 24 hours, additional fines would be assessed daily. I sat down and composed a carefully worded response. I explained that I was a home-based business owner, that my generator was professionally installed and compliant with all local codes, that it was not creating a noise nuisance, and that I believed the HOA was applying the rule unreasonably given the circumstances of a prolonged power outage. I cited Arizona Revised Statute 33-1808, which I had looked up, regarding the requirement for HOAs to act reasonably and in good faith. I sent the email and copied both Brenda and the management company. The power came back on around 9 p.m., much sooner than the utility company had estimated. I shut down the generator, performed the cool-down procedure, and went to bed thinking that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to another email from the HOA. This one informed me that because I had failed to turn off the generator within the time frame specified in the initial warning, I was being assessed the $250 fine. Additionally, the email stated that the HOA board was scheduling a hearing for the following week to discuss additional penalties and potential legal action if I continued to violate community rules. I was furious. I had turned off the generator as soon as the power was restored. The idea that they were still fining me and threatening further action felt like harassment. I called David again. "They are really going after you," he said after I read him the email. "This is Brenda flexing. She probably sees you as someone who challenged her authority, and now she wants to make an example of you. What can I do? Show up to the hearing. Bring documentation. Explain your position. The HOA board is not just Brenda. There are 4 other members. If you can convince even 2 of them that this is ridiculous, you might get the fine reversed. And if I cannot, then you pay the fine, or you fight it in court, which will cost you a lot more than $250 in legal fees." I spent the next week preparing for the HOA hearing. I printed out copies of my generator's specifications, showing its noise level. I got a letter from my electrician confirming that the installation was code compliant. I compiled a list of dates and times I had run the generator over the past 18 months, which was exactly twice during brief power outages, for a total of maybe 6 hours. I even recorded a video from inside my neighbor's house, with permission, showing that you could barely hear the generator when it was running. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse, a single-story building near the neighborhood entrance that housed a small gym, a meeting room, and an office for the management company. When I arrived, there were already several other residents there, apparently waiting for their own hearings about various violations. I recognized a few faces, including Tom, who lived on the next street over and was apparently being cited for painting his mailbox post the wrong color. I was called in at 7:30. The HOA board sat at a long table at the front of the room. Brenda was in the center, flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them. Patricia, a woman in her 60s who always wore floral print dresses and had a kind face, and Robert, a serious-looking man in his 40s who worked in finance. The other two board members I had seen around the neighborhood but did not know personally. Brenda began the hearing by reading out the violation notice. She described how she had personally visited my property and observed the generator in operation, how she had warned me to turn it off, and how I had refused to comply. She showed the board the photos she had taken and presented the email I had sent in response as evidence of my defiant attitude toward community standards. When she finished, she looked at me with barely concealed satisfaction. "Mr. Quincy, do you have anything to say in your defense?" I stood up and distributed the packets I had prepared to each board member. "Yes, I do. First, I want to be clear that I take the HOA rules seriously. I am not trying to be a problem resident. However, I believe this particular application of the generator rule is unreasonable and potentially harmful to my ability to earn a living." I walked them through my documentation, explaining my work, the importance of reliable power, and the steps I had taken to ensure my generator was as unobtrusive as possible. I pointed out that the generator had only been used twice in 18 months, both times during legitimate power outages, and never during late evening or early morning hours when it might disturb sleeping neighbors. "The rule says generators are only allowed for medical emergencies," I continued, "but that seems like an arbitrary restriction when the generator is not causing any actual harm. It is quiet, it is safe, and it is only used when the power is out. Prohibiting it serves no legitimate purpose except to exercise control." Patricia, the kind-looking woman, spoke up. "Mr. Quincy, I think I understand your point, but rules are rules. If we start making exceptions for one person, where does it end?" "I am not asking for an exception," I said. "I am asking for the rule to be applied reasonably. Arizona law requires HOAs to act in good faith and in a reasonable manner. Fining someone for using a quiet, legal generator during a power outage is not reasonable." Robert, the finance guy, leaned forward. "How much noise does this generator actually make? These things can be pretty disruptive." I pulled out my phone and played the video I had recorded from my neighbor's house. The board members leaned in to listen. The generator was audible, but barely, a low hum that was quieter than most conversations. "You can hear it, but just barely," I said. "It is certainly quieter than lawn mowers, leaf blowers, or any of the other motorized equipment people use regularly in this neighborhood." Brenda's face was tight. "The noise level is irrelevant. The rule does not say no loud generators. It says no generators except for medical purposes. Mr. Quincy, you knew the rule, you violated it, and now you are trying to lawyer your way out of the consequences." One of the board members I did not know, a thin man with glasses, spoke up. "What type of work do you do, Mr. Quincy?" "I am an electrical engineer. I consult on large projects, mostly hospitals and medical facilities. I design power systems, backup systems, that sort of thing." "So your work is time-sensitive?" "Very much so. I often have meetings with administrators and construction managers across multiple time zones. If I miss a meeting or a deadline because of a power outage, it can cost my clients significant money and damage my professional reputation." The board members conferred quietly among themselves. I could not hear what they were saying, but I could see Patricia nodding, and Robert seemed to be considering the situation seriously. Brenda, however, looked unmoved. After a few minutes, Brenda called the hearing back to order. "The board will take this matter under advisement. We will issue a written decision within 10 business days. Mr. Quincy, you are dismissed." I left the hearing feeling like I had made my case as well as I could, but with no real sense of whether it would matter. I went home, poured myself a bourbon, and tried not to think about it. The decision arrived 8 days later via email. The HOA board had voted 3-2 to uphold the fine. The decision letter, signed by Brenda as board president, stated that while the board appreciated my explanation, the CCRs were clear, and exceptions could not be made based on individual circumstances. The $250 fine would stand, and any future violations would result in escalating penalties. I was angrier than I had been in years. It was not even about the money, although $250 for doing absolutely nothing wrong was infuriating. It was the principle. The HOA was exercising power for the sake of power, punishing me for having the audacity to question their authority. I paid the fine, but I also started asking questions. I began looking into the HOA's financial records, which Arizona law said had to be available to homeowners upon request. I submitted a formal request to the management company asking for copies of the HOA's budget, bank statements, and meeting minutes for the past 2 years. What I discovered over the next few weeks was interesting. The HOA had been running budget surpluses for years, collecting more in dues than it spent on neighborhood maintenance and services. That was not necessarily unusual, but what caught my attention was a series of payments to something called Maplewood Community Energy Services. The payments were substantial, around $3,000 per month, and they were categorized as utility management fees. I had never heard of Maplewood Community Energy Services. I did some digging and found that it was an LLC registered in Arizona, but the ownership was not immediately clear from public records. What was clear was that it had been formed 3 years ago, right around the time Brenda became HOA president. I called David again. "Do you know anything about Maplewood Community Energy Services?" "Never heard of it." "Why? The HOA is paying them $3,000 a month. I am trying to figure out what for." "That is a lot of money. Have you asked the HOA?" "Not yet. I wanted to get more information first." I kept digging. I found an old article in the local paper about the development of Maplewood Springs. It mentioned that the neighborhood had been designed with a community solar array that provided supplemental power to common areas like streetlights, the clubhouse, and the main entrance gate. The solar array had been installed by the developer and turned over to the HOA when the neighborhood was completed. That made me think. I drove around the neighborhood and located the solar installation. It was behind the clubhouse, a sizable array of panels covering about half an acre, with an equipment shed housing the inverters and battery storage. I had noticed it before but never really thought about it. I started doing calculations. A solar array that size in Arizona, with good sun exposure, could generate a significant amount of electricity. More than enough to power the common areas, certainly. Possibly enough to sell excess power back to the grid, depending on how it was configured. I filed another request with the HOA, this time asking specifically for records related to the solar array and any agreements with Maplewood Community Energy Services. The management company responded that those records were under attorney review and would not be available immediately. That was a red flag. I decided to go directly to the source. I showed up at the next HOA board meeting, which was open to all residents, and during the public comment period, I stood up and asked about the solar array. "Can someone explain to me what Maplewood Community Energy Services does and why we are paying them $3,000 a month?" Brenda looked like she had just bitten into a lemon. "That is an operational matter handled by the board. It does not concern individual homeowners." "With respect, Brenda, we are all paying HOA dues. Those dues fund these payments. I think we have a right to know what we are paying for." Robert, the finance board member, spoke up. "Mr. Quincy has a point. Brenda, can you provide some details? Brenda hesitated. Maplewood Community Energy Services manages the solar array and handles the administrative work related to energy production and grid connection. It is a specialized service that requires technical expertise. What kind of administrative work? I pressed. And who owns this company? That is proprietary information, Brenda said sharply. This is not the appropriate forum for this discussion. But other residents were starting to pay attention now. A woman I did not know raised her hand. I am curious about this too. $3,000 a month seems like a lot for administrative work. Brenda tried to shut down the discussion, but the other board members were clearly uncomfortable. Patricia suggested that the board provide a written report about the solar array and the energy services contract at the next meeting. Brenda reluctantly agreed. I left that meeting knowing I had struck a nerve. I also started to form a hypothesis about what was really going on. Over the next 2 weeks, I did more research. I checked the utility company's records for interconnection agreements, which are public information. I found that the Maplewood Springs solar array was indeed connected to the grid and had a net metering agreement that allowed excess power to be sold back to the utility. I also found that the array was generating significantly more power than the common areas used, which meant the excess was being sold. Then I got a break. I was at the local coffee shop one morning when I ran into Tom, the guy who had been at the HOA hearing for the mailbox post violation. We started talking, and it turned out Tom was an accountant. "You were asking about that energy services company at the board meeting," he said. "I got curious, so I did some digging too. You can look up LLC ownership in Arizona if you know where to look. And Maplewood Community Energy Services is owned by Brenda Morrison. She is the sole member of the LLC." I felt a cold clarity settle over me. "Are you sure?" "Positive. I pulled the formation documents. She set it up 3 years ago, right after she became HOA president. So that was it." Brenda had created a company, hired it to manage the solar array using HOA funds, and was essentially paying herself $3,000 a month for minimal work. The HOA's own solar panels were generating electricity that was being sold back to the grid, producing revenue. And Brenda was skimming money off the top, while also maintaining tight control over everything in the neighborhood, including ridiculous rules about generators. I was not sure if what she was doing was technically illegal, but it was definitely unethical and possibly a breach of her fiduciary duty to the HOA. I spent the next week putting together a detailed report. I documented the payments to Maplewood Community Energy Services, showed that Brenda owned the company, explained how the solar array worked, and calculated that the HOA was likely paying far more than necessary for what amounted to basic equipment maintenance that could be done by any solar technician for a fraction of the cost. At the next HOA board meeting, I distributed copies of my report to every resident who showed up, which was a much larger crowd than usual. Word had gotten around that something interesting was happening with the HOA finances. When the meeting started, I requested time during the public comment period. Brenda tried to limit me to 3 minutes, but the other board members overruled her, sensing that this was important. I walked through my findings methodically. I showed the payments to Maplewood Community Energy Services. I showed that Brenda owned the company. I explained how the solar array worked and how much revenue it was likely generating. I pointed out that in 3 years, the HOA had paid Brenda's company over $100,000 for services that could have been obtained elsewhere for 1/10 of the cost. The room erupted. Residents started shouting questions. Patricia looked shocked. Robert looked furious. Brenda's face had gone pale. "This is outrageous," Brenda said, her voice shaking. "This is a coordinated attack on my character. I have done nothing wrong. The energy services contract was approved by the board. Everything has been properly disclosed." "Show us the disclosure," someone shouted from the back of the room. Brenda could not produce it because, as it turned out, she had never actually disclosed her ownership of the company to the full board or to the homeowners. She had presented it as an independent third-party contractor. The meeting devolved into chaos. Several residents demanded Brenda's resignation. Others called for an independent audit of all HOA finances. Patricia, looking deeply uncomfortable, suggested that the board should consult with an attorney before making any decisions. The meeting was eventually adjourned without any clear resolution, but the damage was done. Within days, 3 of the 5 board members, including Patricia and Robert, signed a letter calling for Brenda's resignation and an independent investigation into HOA finances. Brenda refused to resign. Instead, she hired a lawyer and sent threatening letters to several residents, including me, suggesting that we were engaging in defamation and harassment. Her lawyer argued that there was nothing illegal about the energy services contract and that Brenda had provided valuable services to the community. That might have been where things ended, except for what happened next. It was a Saturday morning, about 2 weeks after the explosive board meeting. I was in my garage working on my generator, doing routine maintenance, when I noticed something odd. There was a sticker on the side of the generator that I had not seen before, or maybe I had just never paid attention to it. It was a metal plate with a serial number and manufacturing details. But what caught my eye was a smaller sticker underneath, partially hidden by the generator's frame. I bent down to look closer. It was a utility interconnection label with an ID number. That was strange. My generator was not connected to the utility grid. It was a standalone backup system with a transfer switch that isolated my house from the grid when it was running. I pulled out my phone and did a search for the ID number. It led me to the utility company's interconnection database. According to the record, my property had a registered interconnection point for distributed generation. I stared at the screen, confused. Then I started to understand. When I had bought the house, it had come with solar panels on the roof. They were a selling point, part of the builder's energy-efficient package. I had assumed they worked like most residential solar systems, generating power during the day that either got used by the house or sold back to the grid, and pulling from the grid at night or when the panels could not keep up with demand. But what if my solar panels were not connected to my house at all? What if they were part of the community solar array? I went inside and pulled up my utility bills for the past 2 years. I had not paid much attention to them because I had automatic payments set up, but now I looked closely at the line items. There was a charge for electricity used, which varied month to month, but there was also a credit labeled Community Solar Subscription. I had assumed that credit was a benefit of living in a solar-powered neighborhood, some kind of shared savings from the community array. But what if it was actually my own solar panels, and the power they generated was being aggregated into the community system? I called the utility company and spent 45 minutes navigating through automated menus until I finally got a real person who could access my account details. "Yes, sir. Your property is part of the Maplewood Springs Community Solar Program," the customer service representative explained. "The panels on your roof are connected to the community array. The power they generate goes into the community pool, and you receive a proportional credit on your bill based on your share of the total generation." "Who administers the community pool? Let me check." It looks like that is managed by the Property Owners Association through a company called Maplewood Community Energy Services. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. My solar panels, which I had paid for as part of my house purchase, were feeding into Brenda's system. She was aggregating power from all the homes in the neighborhood, selling the excess back to the grid, and keeping the revenue for herself while giving homeowners minimal credits on their utility bills. I started calling other residents. It turned out that every house in Maplewood Springs had the same setup. Everyone's rooftop solar panels were connected to the community array, and everyone was getting small credits on their bills while Brenda's company reaped the majority of the financial benefit. The more I dug, the more I realized the scope of what was happening. There were about 200 homes in Maplewood Springs. If each house had a standard 5-kilowatt solar array, that was a megawatt of generating capacity. In Arizona, with excellent sun exposure, that system could produce around 1,500 megawatt hours per year. At current rates, selling that power back to the grid could generate somewhere between $150,000 to $200,000 annually in revenue. And Brenda was capturing most of it through her management company, while paying herself $3,000 a month in administrative fees from HOA dues, and providing minimal credits to the actual homeowners whose solar panels were generating the power. I was not a lawyer, but this seemed like fraud. The homeowners had bought houses with solar panels, believing they owned those systems and would benefit from the power they generated. Instead, they were essentially leasing their panels to Brenda's company for pennies on the dollar. I contacted David, and he connected me with a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Jennifer, and after I explained the situation and showed her all the documentation I had gathered, she let out a low whistle. "This is bad," she said. If the homeowners were not clearly informed about how the solar system worked when they purchased their houses, and if the HOA president is personally profiting from the arrangement without proper disclosure, there are multiple legal issues here. Breach of fiduciary duty, potential fraud, maybe even wire fraud if she used electronic transfers for the payments. What should I do? First, we need to get more homeowners involved. File a class action complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate. They regulate HOAs. Also, you should consider reporting this to the Arizona Corporation Commission, which oversees utility matters. And honestly, given the amount of money involved, you might want to talk to the FBI. This could be federal wire fraud. I spent the next month working with Jennifer and a growing group of angry homeowners. We filed complaints with the state. We hired a forensic accountant to examine the HOA's books. We documented everything. The forensic accountant's report was damning. Over 3 years, Brenda's company had received approximately $600,000 in revenue from selling electricity generated by homeowners' solar panels, while homeowners had received an average of only $1,200 each in utility bill credits. The HOA had paid Maplewood Community Energy Services an additional $108,000 in management fees. Meanwhile, the actual cost of maintaining the solar equipment was estimated at no more than $5,000 per year. Brenda had essentially stolen over $500,000 from the community. The Arizona Department of Real Estate opened an investigation. The local newspaper ran a story about the scandal, and suddenly, Maplewood Springs was in the news. Other HOAs started examining their own solar programs to make sure they were not being similarly exploited. Brenda finally resigned from the HOA board, but she refused to admit any wrongdoing. Her lawyer continued to argue that everything had been legal and properly disclosed, and that homeowners had agreed to the community solar arrangement when they signed their purchase agreements. That argument fell apart when several homeowners, including me, produced our original purchase documents. There was a brief mention of a community solar program buried in 60 pages of HOA disclosures, but nothing that clearly explained the actual structure or the financial implications. Any reasonable person reading those documents would have assumed they owned their solar panels and would directly benefit from the power they generated. The state investigation took months. During that time, the HOA board was completely reconstituted. Patricia stayed on but stepped down from any leadership role. Robert became the new president, and several new members were elected, including Tom, the accountant who had helped me identify Brenda's ownership of the energy services company. The new board's first action was to terminate the contract with Maplewood Community Energy Services. Their second action was to hire an independent solar company to restructure the entire system so that each homeowner's panels would directly serve their own house, with any excess power being sold back to the grid for the homeowner's benefit, not the HOA's. Making those changes turned out to be complicated and expensive, requiring significant electrical work. But the board voted to use the HOA's accumulated surplus funds to cover the cost, which seemed appropriate given that much of that surplus had come from the inflated energy management fees. In the middle of all this, we had another power outage. This one was longer, a monsoon storm that knocked out power to half the city. I fired up my generator without hesitation, and this time, nobody said a word. In fact, several neighbors came over to ask if they could run extension cords to my house to keep their refrigerators running. The legal situation with Brenda dragged on for over a year. The state found that she had violated her fiduciary duty as HOA president and suspended her license to serve on any HOA board in Arizona. The financial penalties were substantial, but recovering the actual money she had taken proved difficult. Her lawyer argued that much of it had already been spent, and forcing her to pay it back would require liquidating assets, including her house. A group of homeowners, organized by Jennifer, filed a civil lawsuit seeking full restitution. That case was still working its way through the courts when something else happened that changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon when I got a call from an FBI agent named Martinez. He explained that they had been investigating Brenda based on the referral from the Arizona Department of Real Estate, and they had found evidence of additional fraudulent activity beyond the solar program. It turned out that Brenda had also been manipulating HOA vendor contracts, accepting kickbacks from landscaping companies and other service providers in exchange for awarding them inflated contracts. She had been running what amounted to a corruption scheme through the HOA for years, using her position to enrich herself at the community's expense. "We are planning to execute a search warrant on her property tomorrow morning," Agent Martinez said. "We wanted to give you a heads up since you have been cooperative with the state investigation. Are you going to arrest her? That depends on what we find. But between you and me, yes, we expect to be making an arrest." The next morning, I watched from my front window as 3 FBI vehicles pulled into Brenda's driveway 4 houses down from mine. Agents in blue windbreakers with FBI in yellow letters on the back entered her house with a search warrant. They were inside for over 3 hours, and when they came out, Brenda was with them, her hands cuffed behind her back. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The woman who had stood on my porch 18 months earlier, demanding that I turn off my generator with such absolute certainty in her authority, was now being loaded into the back of a federal vehicle. I did not feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt tired. This entire situation had consumed so much of my time and energy, time I could have spent on my work or just living my life. But I also felt a sense of justice. Brenda had used her power to bully and control people, to enrich herself at others' expense, and to punish anyone who questioned her authority. Now she was facing consequences. The federal charges were serious: wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and violation of fiduciary duty. The prosecution argued that Brenda had engaged in a systematic scheme to defraud the homeowners association and its members, stealing over $700,000 when all the various schemes were totaled up. Her trial took place 8 months later. I was called to testify about the generator incident and how that had led me to start investigating the HOA's finances. I explained how Brenda had threatened me with fines for doing nothing more than running a legal backup generator during a power outage, and how that rigid, punitive enforcement of rules had seemed inconsistent with someone who was simultaneously violating their fiduciary duties in such a massive way. The prosecutor used my testimony to establish a pattern of Brenda using her position to control and punish community members, while secretly profiting from her authority. Other homeowners testified about similar experiences, times when Brenda had fined them for minor violations or threatened them with legal action while she was running her fraudulent schemes behind the scenes. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, Brenda was found guilty on all counts. Her sentencing hearing was held on a cold morning in February, almost 2 years after she had knocked on my door to tell me to turn off my generator. I attended along with about 20 other residents from Maplewood Springs. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s who had clearly read every page of the case file. She listened to Brenda's lawyer plead for leniency, arguing that Brenda had no prior criminal record and had done substantial community service over the years. Then the judge looked directly at Brenda. "Miss Morrison, you held a position of trust in your community. People elected you to lead their homeowners association, to manage their shared resources, to protect their interests. Instead, you used that position to enrich yourself. You stole from your neighbors. You manipulated contracts, accepted bribes, and created fraudulent schemes to divert money that should have benefited the community into your own pocket. And when people questioned you, you used your authority to intimidate and punish them. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a sustained pattern of criminal behavior over several years." The judge sentenced Brenda to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. She also ordered full restitution to be paid to the Maplewood Springs HOA and its members, though everyone knew that actually recovering all that money would be nearly impossible. As Brenda was led out of the courtroom, she looked over at the section where we were sitting. Her eyes met mine for just a moment. I did not see remorse there, or even anger. Just a kind of blank exhaustion, the look of someone who had finally run out of fight. Life in Maplewood Springs slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board, led by Robert, took a much lighter touch with enforcement. They revised many of the more onerous rules, including the generator policy. The new rule allowed backup generators as long as they met noise standards and were properly installed, which seemed like common sense. The solar system was fully restructured. My panels now fed my house directly, and I received full credit for any excess power that went back to the grid. My electricity bills dropped substantially, which was a nice bonus. I ran into Patricia at the grocery store one afternoon, about 6 months after Brenda's sentencing. She looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "I feel like such a fool," she said. "I was on the board with her for 2 years, and I never suspected anything. She was so organized, so confident about everything. I just assumed she knew what she was doing." "She was good at manipulating people," I said. "That is how con artists work. They project confidence and authority and people trust them, I guess." I just keep thinking about all the times she pushed through decisions, and how we just went along with it because she seemed so sure. Like that stupid generator rule that started this whole thing. I remember when she proposed it. She said it was about maintaining neighborhood standards, preventing noise pollution. It sounded reasonable at the time. But it was really about control, I said. She needed everyone to follow the rules without question, so nobody would start questioning the things that actually mattered, like where the money was going. Patricia nodded. "Robert has been doing a good job as president. He actually asks for input before making decisions. Imagine that." I smiled. Revolutionary concept. The civil lawsuit eventually resulted in a settlement. Brenda's house was sold, and the proceeds were distributed to the homeowners who had been defrauded. I received a check for about $3,500, representing my share of the recovered funds. It was not everything that had been stolen, but it was something. More importantly, the community learned an important lesson about oversight and accountability. The new board instituted regular financial audits, required detailed reporting of all vendor contracts, and made sure that homeowners had easy access to HOA records. They also created a formal process for homeowners to challenge rules they believed were being unfairly enforced. As for me, I kept my generator properly maintained and ready to go. We had a few more power outages over the next year, including a big one that lasted 3 days during a summer heat wave. Each time, my generator kicked in without any drama, and each time, I was grateful I had stood my ground against Brenda's attempt to bully me into compliance. I thought about that a lot, actually. How close I had come to just giving in, just turning off the generator to avoid the hassle. If I had done that, if I had not pushed back and started asking questions, Brenda's schemes might have continued for years. She might have stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars more before anyone noticed. Sometimes standing up to petty tyranny matters, not just because of the immediate issue, but because it exposes larger problems. That generator ban was never really about noise or community standards. It was about maintaining absolute control, about ensuring that nobody questioned the authority structure that Brenda had built to facilitate her fraud. I shared my story at a community forum on HOA governance that was organized by the local newspaper. Other people from other neighborhoods told similar stories about HOA boards that had overreached their authority, or, in some cases, engaged in their own financial misconduct. It turned out that what had happened in Maplewood Springs was not unique. The combination of limited oversight, concentrated authority, and homeowners who were too busy to pay close attention created opportunities for corruption. The forum led to some changes in state law. Arizona passed new requirements for HOA financial transparency. Mandatory independent audits for associations over a certain size, and stricter penalties for board members who violated their fiduciary duties. The legislation was nicknamed Brenda's Law in local news coverage, which seemed appropriate. I ran into Robert at a neighborhood barbecue about 3 years after the whole thing started. He had a beer in his hand and looked more relaxed than I had ever seen him during his board tenure. "I am not running for re-election," he told me. 2 years as HOA president is enough. Time for someone else to take the reins." "You did a good job," I said. "You cleaned up a huge mess. We all did, you especially." If you had not pushed back on that generator nonsense, none of this would have come to light. He took a sip of his beer. It is funny how the small things lead to the big things sometimes. It is, I agreed. Hey, I have been meaning to ask you something, Robert said. That first day when Brenda came to your door and told you to turn off the generator, did you know something bigger was going on? Is that why you refused? I thought about that. No. At the time, I just thought she was being unreasonable. I was annoyed about the principle of the thing, about being fined for something that was not hurting anyone. I had no idea about the financial stuff. So you were just being stubborn, Robert grinned. Basically, yes. Sometimes being stubborn works out. David, my neighbor who had given me legal advice at the beginning of all this, joined our conversation. He had a plate piled high with burgers and potato salad. Are you two talking about the infamous generator incident? He asked. We were just reminiscing, I said. That whole thing was wild, David said. I have been practicing law for 30 years, and I have never seen an HOA case that went from a simple rule violation to federal prison time. You should write a book about it. I do not think my life is that interesting, I said. Are you kidding? Generator ban leads to federal wire fraud investigation. That is a great hook. We laughed about it, but later that evening, I did think about writing down the whole story. Not for a book, but just to have a record of what had happened and how it had unfolded. Sometimes it is easy to forget the details, to lose track of how one thing led to another. So I sat down at my computer and started typing. I began with that moment when the lights went out on a Tuesday afternoon, and I made the simple decision to start my backup generator. I tried to capture the frustration I felt when Brenda showed up with her rigid enforcement of an unreasonable rule, the growing suspicion as I uncovered the financial irregularities, the satisfaction of seeing justice eventually served. Writing it all out, I was struck by how much had hinged on small decisions. If I had not asked for the HOA financial records, if Tom had not thought to look up the LLC ownership, if the FBI agent had not taken the referral seriously, if any one of a dozen things had gone differently, the outcome would have been completely different. I finished writing my account late one night, saved the file, and shut down my computer. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. The streetlights were on, powered now by a properly managed solar system that benefited all the homeowners equally. The air conditioning in my house was running smoothly, powered by my own solar panels during the day and by the grid at night, with my generator standing ready in the garage if either of those sources failed. It was a good life, made better by the fact that the community was no longer being run by someone who saw it as a personal fiefdom to be exploited. The new board was not perfect, but they were honest and transparent, which was really all anyone could ask for. I thought about Brenda sometimes, sitting in federal prison, probably still convinced that she had done nothing wrong. People like her rarely accepted responsibility for their actions. They always found ways to justify their behavior, to frame themselves as the victim. But I also thought about all the neighbors who had been affected by her schemes, the money that had been stolen from them, the trust that had been violated. Some of them were still angry. Some had moved away, wanting nothing more to do with HOA living. Others, like me, had decided to stay and help rebuild what Brenda had broken. In the end, what started with a banned generator during a power outage became a lesson in the importance of questioning authority, demanding transparency, and standing up for what is right even when it is inconvenient. Those principles applied far beyond HOAs, beyond Maplewood Springs, beyond Arizona. They were principles worth defending, even if it meant going up against someone who seemed to hold all the power. Because as I learned, that power was often more fragile than it appeared. It depended on people not asking questions, not pushing back, not demanding accountability. The moment enough people started asking those questions, the whole corrupt structure came tumbling down. I hope that other people in other communities would remember that. When faced with petty tyranny, with rules that did not make sense, with authority figures who seemed more interested in control than in service, sometimes the right response was to push back, to ask questions, to demand transparency. Sometimes it started with something as simple as refusing to turn off a generator.